So our last presentation for today is Triple Consciousness of a Soul, Whitney Houston, Power, Peril of a Diva. Power and Peril of a Diva. Introducing our fantastic speakers, we have Kate Petty. Kate is a practicing astrologer, visual artist, and therapist in training in Seattle, Washington. Her approach to astrology is integrative, experimental, and client-centered. Since 2010, her primary focus has been on Hellenistic, early medieval, and Uranian astrology. She has presented at conferences in the United States and abroad, and published articles in online and print magazines. She holds a BA from the Evergreen State College in transpersonal psychology and expressive arts, and is pursuing a Master's of Arts in couples and family therapy at Seattle University. A longtime volunteer in the state's women's prison, Kate is devoted to exploring the intersection of arts, spirituality, social justice, and meaning making. Tending to existential concerns of those she served for almost 2 decades, she has created and facilitated programs in arts, grief work, and self-care. Like the maximum at Delphi, know thyself, Kate sees astrology as an exceptional tool for self-realization, as well as for understanding others and the world around us. And you can find out more at our website, which I can't see at the bottom of the screen here, ambientastrology.com, I believe that is, and you can find her on Instagram. And Gray is a professional natal and horary astrologer from Olympia, Washington, the land of the Sasquin and Nisqually. Forgive me if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. Gray brings a relational approach to astrology using techniques drawn from ancient and modern sources, synthesizing influences from Hellenistic, magical, mythic archetypal, and psychological astrology. Gray has taught at UAC, NORWAC, and ESAR astrology conferences, various astrology associations around the United States, and is a member of the faculty at KeplerCollege. Gray's astrological writings have been published on astrology.com, in Wellbeing Astrology, and by Ignota Press. Gray can be contacted on his site graycrawford.net, where he also writes astrology articles and offers astrological education. And of course, you can go to his website, graycrawford.net, where he also on Facebook, I'm trying to see, Instagram and Threads. And I will point out a fabulous YouTube channel. Is that just Gray Crawford, Gray, if you just type that into YouTube?
Yeah, Gray Crawford Astrology.
Wonderful. Type that in YouTube, an excellent channel there. On to our next speaker, Bear River. Bear is a professional consulting astrologer with roots up and down the West Coast. He began his studies in 2001 with modern perspectives, using lunar cycles to time his queer youth activist campaigns. Launching his practice in 2018, he was named Most Promising Astrologer by OPA that same year. Since then, Bear has earned certifications in horary, Hellenistic, and electional astrology. He's shared his time as a mentor and presenter and has presented talks at NORWAC, WSAA, Synchronicity University, and ESAR's conference. Bear teaches for KeplerCollege, is a TA for Austin Coppock, and runs classes of his own. Outside of classes and consults, you can find him writing books, staring up at the stars, or at bearriver.com. And on to Samuel Ogden. Sam is an undergraduate student in classical studies at Bard College in upstate New York. He began studying modern psychological astrology in 2004. In 2019, Sam embarked on a certification in ancient astrology with renowned astrologer Demetra George, an experience which inspired him to return to academia to study classical languages and civilizations. A Hatha yoga instructor since 2011, Sam combines his passion for mindfulness with hands-on work in nature. His dedication to sustainable living led him to apprentice and participate in construction projects across California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Rhode Island, and Virginia, beginning in 2013. Since 2017, he has worked as a gardener and landscape laborer, planting perennial gardens and constructing patios, walkways, and stone walls. Sam envisions establishing a center for astrological studies housed in a sustainably built earthen structure. This space will prioritize high-quality indoor air to support cognitive health. he is particularly committed to promoting ancient language literacy within the astrological community. And with that, I'm going to pass on the baton to our final fantastic presenters.
So today we will be talking about Whitney Houston and the triple consciousness, power, and peril of this incredible diva. When you look at this chart, it may not look at first glance like the chart of somebody who went on to become one of the most successful recording musicians of all time. And when we say of all time, I mean things like The Bodyguard original soundtrack, which is the best-selling soundtrack of all time. Her debut album, which was the most successful debut album of all time. And we could go on to a long list of accolades. I'm going to try to keep my section snappy so we can really focus on timing today. We thought about triple consciousness because of this really powerful quote by W.E.B. Du Bois from The Souls of Black Folks, where he says, "It's a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro. Two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." And this is something we see in the life and in the chart of Whitney Houston. Even a little bit in the movie The Bodyguard, which really solidified her position in popular culture consciousness. So when we look at this chart and we think about planetary condition, you may start by going, well, wait a second, Bear. This isn't the chart of the most successful person. Almost every single planet is in a dark house. We look at Venus, a planet that's already associated with vocals, with music, and you say, well, this Venus is really close to the sun. This Venus is combust, in fact, not visible, in the sixth house. How does this Venus come about to support such a powerful vocalist, somebody who became known as the voice? I don't think you can get more Venusian than that. We've got Jupiter stationing retrograde. We've got the moon in a sign where she has no dignity. Mars ruling the moon and opposite the moon. We've got Saturn, the malefic contrary to the sect, the most difficult planet in the chart, as was said earlier in today's presentations. We've got Saturn opposing both the sun and the moon. And again, you might think, well, that looks like that would be contrary to the type of visibility and to the powerful voice of this singer. And even if we go down to the level of thinking about the planets that are there to support the sect light, so we're looking at this nocturnal chart, we look to the moon and we'll ask ourselves, which planets belong to the same triplicity of the moon? Who's there to support this fiery moon? And in a night chart, we look at Jupiter and we go, okay, that's pretty good, right? Jupiter's a benefic planet, but looking at that dark house position, we have to mark down just a touch how beneficial we might think this Jupiter would be. And we can go on and on, but like I said, I want to keep this snappy because the timing really illustrates how this natal foundation starts to bloom in her life for both the most successful debut record of all time, for somebody who was really a pioneer and broke quite a few barriers. If we go back and we think about The Bodyguard, this movie is a movie that came close to not being made, or at least not having Whitney as the star of the film, because Warner Brothers was dubious, was actually really concerned about having a film that featured an interracial romance. For those of us today looking back on her career, this race barrier breaking quality might be really easy to forget about. But at the time, Whitney really broke barriers between R&B, a genre that was considered a black genre, and pop music, which was not a genre that was really open to black artists in the same way until Whitney. When we look at the positive conditions in her chart, you might start by saying the list isn't very long. We've got to get into some more of the granular details to really see this. We see that Jupiter is the triplicity lord of the sect light, and if we're thinking just about the fact that the second house is a dark house, we might overlook the fact that when we take into consideration the lot of fortune, which creates its own angles, Jupiter is actually angular to fortune, not just angular to fortune, but in the best possible angular house relative to fortune. We've got Jupiter 10th from fortune, and Sam's going to talk more about that. And when we consider this 10th from fortune relationship, not just from Jupiter, but also the moon, we see that the moon is ruling fortune, and Jupiter is the exaltation lord of fortune. Both of those really matter, and we'll see how this particular facet of her chart supports her glorious rise to power. And then we'll show you this in another slide. If we really focus in, and this is something that I thought about in the context of Defoe's quote, that there is this two-ness, this otherness, this double consciousness that we can see in those dark houses, and we know is a part of her life based on her very, very public story. Something that I see repeatedly with clients and in charts of public figures is this opposition between Saturn and Venus. The opposition to Saturn and Venus here is quite intense. If we look down to other layers of dignity, we see that it's not just an opposition, which is an aspect that is archetypally Saturnian, but that Venus is in the bounds of Saturn. The material manifestation of Venus is literally bounded or confined by Saturn. And there again with the sun, also in the bounds of Saturn. And while we don't have it displayed here on this chart, if we think down to the level of the 12th parts or the dodecatomoria, you'll find that the sun is in the Aquarius 12th part of Leo. So we get this emphasis over and over again between the barriers, the limitations. Vettius Valens says that Saturn causes social harm, this opposition between Saturn and Venus. And we do see this in her life. Valens says particularly of this combination between Saturn, Venus, and the sun that they're indicative of lofty associations, honors and deeds, and they're the cause of high rank, distinction, preeminence amongst the masses. Check for Whitney Houston on all accounts. But Valens goes on to say that they are also unstable with respect to property or other matters, and that they involve men in ups and downs. They dissolve friendships. They affect the reduction of livelihood. They bring public exposure or punishments arising from the betrayal of females or religious matters, and that they cause men to be unstable and bisexual in their intercourse and other relationships, all things that we found out after Whitney's life had concluded. This comes from Vettius Valens' anthologies. That'll be in book 1, chapter 20, if you're reading the edition that Chris published with Amor Fati. We see this echoed even a little bit earlier with Dorotheus, and I found this particular quote to be one of those joyous quotes where you see something that's so specific. If Saturn looked at Venus from the opposition, he will be indecent in fornication and disgrace. That's maybe a less supportive or less supportive way of identifying queerness in the chart, but we see this over and over again, not just in the Hellenistic tradition, but later, that the Saturn-Venus relationship, the social harm, can also show up for folks who are queer, or for folks who are living that double consciousness life of being both inside and outside of social barriers. He'll be indecent in fornication, disgraced, and he will not marry, but if he does marry, he will marry a disgraced singer. And this is a very big part of Whitney's public life, her relationship with Bobby Brown, which we'll get to as we get into timing. With these aspects, you may think, well, that's really not going to work out for her. But if we pay really close attention to the degree positions of the moon and the sun, we'll see that the moon actually casts a ray. This should be on the next slide. No, the moon actually casts a ray, and I'll annotate this for us. This 17-degree ray intercedes and actually cuts off the sun from that opposition of Saturn. And so the sun is moving in to the moon rather than Saturn. And this does dramatically reduce that restriction and reversal, or at least it delays it for a good while in her life, allowing her to have that flourishing early career. And the sun does the same for the moon. If we, the sun helps the moon with respect to the opposition of Mars. The sun casting that ray to 16 degrees frees up the moon from that very harsh opposition to Mars. And then Jupiter, we've got to look down at the minutes here to see that actually the moon forms that conjunction with Jupiter before reaching that superior sextile from Saturn, preventing the moon from experiencing malefic enclosure. And these two things become a real saving grace for her. Unless there's... Kate will talk about some Antiscia that comes in and helps Jupiter quite a bit, and we'll unfold some more of the chart. But that's it for natal condition. We'll talk some more about other things as we get through timing.
Yeah, thank you, Bear. So again, Bear will be teaching a course on planetary conditions this summer, where you can go into learning all about all of that more in depth. And mentioned I do teach a course on zodiacal releasing. That'll be part of the timing technique certificate. We'll touch on that technique a little bit later today. But right now I'm going to talk about some of the foundational chart structures and rulers in Whitney's chart, which is a course that will be part of the natal astrology certificate that I'll be teaching. So in astrology, a lot of you probably will focus in on the Lord of the ascendant or the Lord of the midheaven as being planets that have really particularly important roles in overseeing the life direction and calling and presence of the natal chart that you're working with. And those planets are also considered to be very important in Hellenistic astrology. But Hellenistic astrology does have numerous techniques indicating other planets in addition to the lords of the ascendant and the midheaven to take on this larger role of overseeing the life direction and the prosperity of the person beyond just the normal associations you have with those planets or the house topics that they might be responsible for. And so when we open our perspective to that with Hellenistic astrology, we actually open up a lot greater complexity within that living system of the natal chart and the many relations. Sometimes this can bring in greater complexity with a larger number of planets coming into very prominent roles. And sometimes it can also really reinforce some of the really key planets that we're already thinking about. And so with Whitney and how Bear was, describing, just like she's so famous for the bodyguard, and we're seeing Moon Jupiter coming in there in this kind of bodyguard role in her chart. You can go to the next slide there. We see that importance in Whitney's chart with this Moon Jupiter in that second place, known as the Gate of Hades. It is one of those dark houses that's all associated with finances and money and having a lot of focus being directed there. So as mentioned, Bear is talking about the importance of her Venus. It is true that Venus is extra important too because her ascendant is Pisces. That is the exaltation of Venus. That ascendant also happens to be in the bounds of Venus. But of course, the ascendant is in the watery home of Jupiter and Pisces. And so that Jupiter and Pisces is directing that life force into that second house with the moon there. Her midheaven is also the fiery home of Jupiter. So those vocational public role topics of her career are also being directed down into that second house of generating money and finances. And she signed, in addition to all those record-breaking albums, she signed what's often considered to be at the time a record-breaking record contract for over $100 million in the early 2000s. In addition to that, Bear already mentioned how there's a really important thing about sect, the fact that this is a night chart. So she is born at night. And so we have this alliance of the lunar school of thought, and that moon is the queen of these night planets that are going to be especially supportive for her. So that's going to include Mars in Libra, that Venus in Leo, and it does include her Mercury because she has an evening star Mercury that is exalted, that is also angular. But the moon is, the queen of these night planets, and so is particularly important. Again, in that second house, as Bear mentioned, Jupiter has even greater prominence because Jupiter is a triplicity ruler of that sect light, which is going to be a planet we're going to look to also indicate support and prosperity and honors and these sorts of things that she does generate with her life. And as Bear mentioned, the additional factor is that lot of fortune, which is Cancer, which is in the fifth house. The lot of fortune, as Larry beautifully described, is that lot of the moon. And it is an incredibly powerful symbol of material prosperity, material well-being. What is it like being a soul in a body in this world of things being born and passing away and rises and falls of fortune? So the moon has even greater prominence by being that lord of fortune, again directed into the second house. And we can think about while there are a lot of things in these dark houses, the lot of fortune though is in the fifth house. And so when we're already thinking about night charts maybe being more connected to physical senses and the body and passions and pleasures, the lot of fortune is indicating these themes of passions and pleasures are going to be particularly important for her. Of course, another big theme of the fifth house is creativity, artistic creativity, and being the joy of Venus. In this case, we have, one of the greatest, arguably, you could make a case of her being the greatest, even female vocalist of all time. We also have the topic of children. And all of these topics are being directed into that second house of financial concern. Now, she does have a daughter that she has a complicated relationship with later on, but she also, with that ability to generate all this money, she did establish the Whitney Houston Foundation for Children around issues of homelessness, children with cancer and AIDS, and just general self-empowerment. And so there was this, wealth on behalf of children. And you could even think about also just one of her most famous songs, The Greatest Love, which literally begins with the line, "I believe the children are our future. Teach them well and let them lead the way. Show them all the beauty they possess inside. Give them a sense of pride to make it easier. Let the children's laughter remind us of how we used to be." And if you know that song, you know what comes next. And just the incredible power of her voice, that when she gets to these certain places, even though she's in this great artistic talent is being strategically crafted and conditioned to fit into this commercial pop market and appeal to a mainstream white audience, she transcends whatever form she's in. I can go to the next slide, Bear. And so there is an additional importance here, just of how, I don't have time to go into all the depths of this, but when we're already talking about how important this moon Jupiter is, it's also important to realize that they are in these intensified magnitude of conditions. One reason is because they are forming a tight square aspect with the lunar nodes, which does intensify both the meaning of the moon and Jupiter, but it is especially intensifying the magnitude of her moon because her moon is at the square of her own nodes. down at the southern bending of the nodes, which means the moon has descended across the ecliptic zodiac belt, come down and descended to that critical turning point of lowest latitude, getting ready for this ascent upwards back to the north node. And we do have the symbolism of her, of somebody who ascends and rises from these great depths into greater power. Of course, she also has a great downfall that's very tragic. What's really fascinating, though, is the planetary nodes of Jupiter also happen to be in Cancer and Capricorn. And if I were to throw the geocentric north node of Jupiter on here, it would be about 16 Cancer. So it's within Jupiter's also within 4 degrees of squaring its own node. So the Moon and Jupiter are really at the bendings of their own nodes. In addition, Jupiter is stationing retrograde. When the planet is stationing within 7 days of a person's birth, or becoming visible or becoming invisible, these are conditions that dramatically intensify the presence and magnitude of the planet. And so it's just like this hyper intense Moon Jupiter. You can go to the next slide, Bear. And then this Moon Jupiter, as Bear mentioned, it's being directed into this 8th place, and the Mars is in Libra. And so this is also bringing in a lot of the complexity as well as tragedy of her life. I mean, certainly it connects with all of, while she's generating all this money, which also she is able to use to create this charity for children, as we'll talk a little bit about in a moment, relating to Mars ruling the lot of Daimon. She also does work internationally on behalf of apartheid significantly in South Africa at this time. But there's obviously a lot of entanglements and financial entanglements and obligations. And of course, as Bear already alluded to, she ends up in an abusive marriage with Bobby Brown. The 8th place can also go with mental anguish. She does lose herself to addictions. Of course, she has a tragic life. She was abused as a child, molested by an extended family member. She witnessed in Newark. She was born in Newark. The Newark riots happened when she was only like 3 years old. She was like aware of that. You know, she's facing all these racial barriers, gender barriers that she's smashing through, but we're also seeing, you know, that 8th house Mars really complicates matters for her, although it is also at the same time the source of power. You can go to the next slide. Bear already mentioned this with the lot of fortune, but it's also just then significant when we cast that lot of fortune chart, which is important to do in Hellenistic astrology, because as Larry talked about earlier, you can use this lot of fortune chart as another way to look at house topics and signifiers in the chart, and it can function as another version of the natal chart. And we see that Moon Jupiter up at the 10th place, the Moon, the domicile lord of fortune, Jupiter, the exaltation lord of fortune, in that intensified condition they have. The 11th place of fortune is also important as a place of acquisition. There's no planet there, but it is ruled by Venus down in the 2nd from fortune, again, kind of reinforcing these 2nd house themes. And very significantly, we'll talk about this later, but Saturn in Aquarius in the 8th place from fortune does speak to her eventual death by drowning, and that'll show up later. I also should mention this is using the night chart calculation for the lot of fortune. When you reverse that calculation, it does seem to work well for her chart. You can go to the next slide. And just keeping on this, when we look at the lot of Daimon, which modern astrologers often choose to translate as the lot of spirit, this is the lot of the sun. And so this is also her sun-moon relationship being projected from the ascendant. In the fortune chart, Daimon shows up in the 5th place, again, showing this importance of passions, pleasure, creativity, children. And though Mars is in the 8th natally, it does become angular in the fortune chart, which is showing this activation of these 8th house themes becoming more active and big for her. And we don't really have time to go through all of this, but there's so much about her family, her ancestry that's so important. Her mom is a legendary gospel singer who won 2 Grammy Awards for being like the best gospel performances. Her father is in the military. Her father became her business manager, very intense business manager that became a very complicated relationship. As we'll talk about in a little bit, she becomes famous literally singing a song called Home from The Wiz. You could even think about fourth house patriotism. She's very famous for singing the Star Spangled Banner to a level most people are not famous for. You go to the next slide. But really natally, we want to think about that lot of Daimon being up in Scorpio in the ninth place, ruled by that Mars in Libra in the eighth place, who is an aversion. And although the ninth is like considered like the most favorable of all the cadent houses, it has that nice trine to the ascendant. It's still a cadent falling place. And there is then in this, great fame, this liminality and this double consciousness, this being in betweenness that she has, as well as Mars being an aversion to that daimon, a lot of spirit. This shows some of the complexity of her inner life and character in relation to this fame. And I mentioned also there is the, ninth house location, international, huge world tours. In this time of apartheid starting to be dismantled at the last Saturn-Neptune conjunction, she performed at Mandela's 70th birthday concert to raise awareness of apartheid. Once Mandela is elected, she shows up. She's the first musical performer to go to South Africa and perform. She raised huge amounts of money on behalf of ending apartheid. And I think most of all, though, we think about the voice. And literally, when you're talking about the music of the spheres, divinity comes through her voice in this incredible, transcendent, powerful way. In Demetra George's book on the houses, she had this great quote about the 16th century French astrologer Marinus, who said, God gives humanity life, which is like the first house, so they may worship God, which is the ninth house, and beget their own likeness, which is the fifth house. And it's this flow of the first, ninth, and fifth with divine artistic creativity, which you really see with her and the relationships between these planets. And then just, to note, obviously, Hellenistic astrologers would not have known about the existence of Neptune and Chiron, but, they do exist. And obviously, the Neptune, we can also, of course, link in the divine voice with that being in Scorpio with a lot of daimon, the addictions, and then that Chiron ability to transmit this incredible resonance of her voice in ways that really uplift and humanity and really bring healing and catharsis to people who hear her voice, even though it's also a point of great wounding. And I will now hand over to Kate, who is going to go into Antiscia.
Thank you, Gray and Bear, and everyone here. Thank you, Kepler, for having us on. I will say, I'm going to try to give you what I've got on Antiscia quickly, but always feel like if you want more info sooner than my course comes in the summer, there is a free talk on Kepler's YouTube, and you can learn a lot more about Antiscia there. But diving in here, and I have a number of slides, so we'll move kind of quickly through the first ones, but this is kind of a different way to look at the chart, to perceive the chart. It's the same chart, but it's oriented around the seasonal turning points. And Antiscia, if this is a new concept for people, is a word that means opposite shadow. And it's a technique that was used by, it seems, all ancient astrologers, was referenced in works, sometimes quite briefly. But it's really about light and darkness and time. But light and sharing light, reflecting light. And it's about the seasonal turning points. So the Aries point, like this week, right? The solstice point, these points are turning points of the season, of the year, of the earth that we live on. And it has to do with our orbit of the sun, right? That sets up the zodiac. So we'll come back to this chart. So yeah, let's move. Antiscia, as referenced, this is sharing light, right? So these are reflections around the solstice point. And Contra-Antiscia are reflections around the Aries and Libra equinox, right? These days of exactly equal light and darkness. And Chris gave a great description of right ascension and goddess oriented to the equator and the ecliptic's intersection, which on the next slide we'll see too. Yeah, thank you, Fair. I know it's a bit. So this, is the map, right, of the stars from our viewpoint. But I like to show it because really when we're working with the zodiac, we're working with a circle, right? The circle of the year, the wheel of the year. This is the circle outstretched, right? This is the sun's path. This is what makes Antiscia. It's really straightforward. I think sometimes it can seem complicated. And truly, it's earthy and real and experiential. It's our literal experience of light wherever we are on the earth, right? There's a quantity of light. Like right now, such a special time, 2 days ago, having this even day and night, and we'll start building toward that solstice, toward the Cancer ingress. So, the lightest week of the year. So that reflection of light, very simply, is like if, let's say in a couple weeks from now or sometime, I don't know, May 1st, right? There's a certain amount of light. If you go forward beyond the solstice, you're going to have that reflected. So it's just these symmetries of light, and they kind of mirror parallel and contra-parallel, which we're not going to talk about today. All of that would be covered in the course. But yeah, moving to the next slide, maybe. When we are looking at Whitney's chart, at anyone's chart, we can perceive and want to actually check to see if these aspects are here, because as you will see very clearly with Whitney Houston, when they're present, they have a lot of power and they have a lot to say, and on the world stage, it seems, right? So, and the reason why it pertains to the world and kind of pulls a person into the world is these critical turning points of the wheel of the year. So again, the equinox and solstice points. Now, when we're looking for Antiscia, which because they're not like, looking at a trine and you're looking at something at 17 and 16, you have to think of these symmetries as opening and reflection. So it's always going to be a little bit of a math problem or a visual math problem. So I put this diagram up here just to, give you a sense about this, but you'd always be, if you have a degree, you're going to subtract it from 30. That's one way to think about it. Another is that you're adding cardinal to mutable, as you can see in the signs that are reflected, are always going to be a cardinal back to a mutable, or fixed signs. So always think too that with Antiscia, fixed signs connect. So it kind of creates this big fixed square, right, in the center. And those are also, the midpoint to the seasonal turning points, the cross quarters, which we have a slide for as well. I'm not sure if that's, yeah. This is another diagram that also shows temperament. So just a sneak peek at that. I'll be going into that in my course. It's another way to also think about these pairings. I mean, this can be very poetic, very creative way to work, both between the signs and then when you get into the planetary pairings, that's, they're both tremendously juicy. Yeah, let's forward. So back to this cross quarter holiday, as we'll be, approaching soon enough here. We're at the ingress, but Beltane, May 1st, will be the first cross quarter we hit. And we kind of think of that as between seasons, right? So there's that fixed point. And then we'll hit midsummer at the solstice. Hopefully this is pretty straightforward as far as these reflections go. Did really appreciate Christopher Cheng-Yi Chow had made this slide for me. Just want to honor that. Yeah, think it's beautiful. All right, so back to Whitney's chart. Really powerful Antiscia signatures, which become so important as Bear kind of showed us the preponderance of planets in dark houses. but how those also move into important critical angles from fortune. They're really brought to light in a major way on the world stage. So you can see that there are quite a number of Antiscia signatures. We're going to get into some timing in a little bit that will underscore, her luminary of sect moon connecting to its bound ruler. There's an exchange going on. But you can see these general signatures, the sun at roughly 18 Leo reflecting, or 17 to Neptune at 12, almost 13. It's an exact Contra-Antiscia. So they share, as it states here, rising ascensional time, which Chris mentioned earlier if you were here for that talk. That becomes critically important for timing because those years become activated. But you also see, right, that with those darker houses, averse houses, a lot of the planets, like, again, the ruler of the chart, Jupiter, and the luminary of sect are strongly connected actually to both the ascendant and Chiron, and the moon Chiron is so close. So it's this aspect of shared time that actually was likened to a conjunction by Ibn Ezra, and other astrologers, including Robert Schmidt, would refer to these as, not having testimony. They rise at the same time, so that shared time. But connecting to the angle, and of course that these are such personal points, right? The moon being our emotion. I mean, and the moon connected to Mercury, even in the kind of early modern work of Eberton, combination of stellar influences, right? Moon Mercury is thinking, you could say speaking or singing, influenced by feeling, right? You can take these combinations and work with them that way as like a kind of archetype or a planetary combination that is just very powerful. So Mercury connecting to the moon and Jupiter connecting, huge success, but just broad, expansive, just exaggerating and beautifying this voice and emotionality. Pluto there too, so extreme. I think also kind of underscoring the extremes in the life. And Jupiter Pluto, of course, is kind of a classic. I think they call it a millionaire, billionaire type aspect, right? It can be great wealth. This is like great, riches of the underworld, the things that are buried. There's so much we could unpack with that. The sun Neptune is, on one hand, extremely mystical and miraculous and beautiful and divine, and on another, as Eberton would also write, and there can be a weakness or a sickness or being victimized, or one obviously thinks of the addiction that she was struggling with. And I think about also the projections and our judgment of people battling addiction, people that need more help, the way that we morally judge people as if it's not something that has taken over their body, and she needed help. So these planetary combinations also show up, as I stated, in critically important times of the rise of her life, and also challenging times with the Sun Neptune. Let's forward to the next slide. This is just not to freak anyone out, but a really quick and easy way to find Antiscia if you have software. I don't know of dials, because you can move them around. I don't know of dials online so far. Open source probably is. I don't know everything. This one is from SolarFire software. And if you have a software that has a dial, usually there's just a little point where you can click to dial, and this is what it will do. And, keep it on the 360-degree wheel as opposed to 90 when you're looking at Antiscia and Contra-Antiscia, to keep it straight. But, you would point the dial at Aries and you will see these reflections, these openings. It's a very fast way to find Antiscia. So you don't have to, you could check, if you think you see it, you have some degrees close. And then you just would pull the pointer over to 90, which is where Cancer is, right? Aries to Cancer, 90-degree square, that turning point, and you would see here that Mercury, Moon, etc. That's the fastest way to find Antiscia on software, and useful tool. And let's see, next slide. Here I'm including the chart just back, right? And with the bounds, Gray mentioned those Venus bounds at the ascendant, so important. I think that while I'm really kind of looking at that Sun Neptune as a very close signature Contra-Antiscia, Venus is definitely there, right? And I can't help but just note the greatest love. Music, right? I mean, songs that she's known for. And then again, the voice as far as the moon. There's so much to say. Also, these signs of shared light were called equal power. They were thought of as sharing power. And there's something very powerful about that equal power. And when you think of also the bodyguard and other glass ceilings that she was breaking in terms of just the way that her life unfolded in various ways. But the equal power and the tying of verse, signs and houses feels really critically important too, right? As a descriptor, as like a quality that's added to the chart, because the Sun Neptune is clearly, right, fixed signs. So they're in square. There's no getting around that square that's present. They just happen to also be Antiscia, which is another way to work this out, right, is that the square is visible on the world stage. So sometimes this is not Hellenistic, but you might have a unique aspect like a quintile on an Antiscia reflection, and that is what is connecting to the world. This is just another little level of nuance. But yeah, so tying the averse houses though, right? So you really see how that second house, the gate of Hades, the second house of also, I just want to note, right? It's resources, and included in resources is our allies, our early family, and literally our voice. It's things we put in and out. It's food, right? It's what goes in and out of our mouth. So that voice. Yeah. Let's see, where are we next with slide? Yeah. So I grabbed this quote from Ibn Ezra to kind of underscore what I mentioned earlier as far as looking at degrees that are of the same ascension. Again, that's the Contra-Antiscia, and it's shared rising time. And you can reference back to Chris's talk earlier in the second panel. He described it very nicely. And you can really think about why, of course, signs would share time rising, because it's all symmetry. It's a circle, right? And cut in half and half again. And you think about the time around Aries, coming from Pisces to Aries, it's part of the sine wave. It's an even flow. It's just that circle unfolded. So that's why two signs will always share rising. So in his example, he's mentioning 10 degrees at Aries. At the other side is 20 degrees Pisces. So the distance of both of them from the line of justice, the equinox axis, is equal, and they are considered as being in conjunction. I think the next slide just shows us, again, this ascensional timetable you can find on AstroSeek. So you can look at this for your chart. It's very location sensitive. It really matters where a person's born. You know, if I'm up in Seattle and I'm going to have different amounts of time and so-called ages, like in my life, right? Because it's basically a degree per year of the life. This is a timing technique that I think Chris is going to work with. And I'll also be covering this in Antiscia because it is a piece of this work. And as you've seen, how it ties kind of hidden averse houses together, and they ripen at the same time as well. So you're probably getting a feel for how much nuance and just detail you can pull out. But here, before I hand off to Sam, just leave you with that those two Contra-Antiscia really prominent points are ripening at 17.84, so in 1980, and then the Leo Scorpio in 2001. So I think from here we get into some timing. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Kate and Bear and Gray, that's a really wonderful setup, and thank you, Kepler, for this wonderful event. So I'm going to be looking at Whitney Houston's annual Profections from years 1980 to 1982. So next slide. And we already had a very nice setup for this whole technique. So just a very brief, quick summary of the technique. It takes a year for a house. So the first house is the first year of life. It's when you're born. And then the second house is the second year of life, or yeah, the second house is the second year of life when you're 1 year old. The third house, when you're 2 years old, third year of life, etc. And you keep counting around the wheel like that. In terms of interpretation, oh, can you go back? Actually, just real quick, I'll just go through this real quick. The zodiac, in terms of interpretation for interpreting each perfected year, you're going to look at the zodiacal sign, the planetary ruler of that sign, as well as any planets that are present in that house. All of those things become activated. So in other words, the inherent natal pattern emerges or repeats itself in each perfected year based on what's there specifically. So the perfected years basically give events and circumstances that are definitive or thematic. And so I'll be looking at Whitney's rise from the beginning of her rise from being a fashion model for her first record deal. So there are a couple different ways that you can perfect. You can do it from many different places. I'll be looking at both the perfecting from the ascendant and her lot of spirit, which is in Scorpio. From the ascendant, we're looking at houses 6, 7, 8. From spirit, it's 2, 3, and 4. And the reason I chose the lot of spirit is because, as has already been mentioned by Gray, I think the lot of spirit, the lot of daimon, is the lot of the sun. It has to do with spiritual matters, but also career matters. And I think Larry mentioned too, you know, what a person does with their life and kind of how they're known, the reputation. So next slide. This quote is from Valens in his anthology in book 2, section 20 about the lots. He says, and perfections. He says, nativities will be considered glorious, distinguished, and vigorous if they, meaning fortune and or daimon, are from the sun and moon, meaning if they're in Leo or Cancer, and if benefics are in conjunction or inclined to these places or house rulers. So if benefics are there with the in those places, or if they are present with the rulers of those places. Then he says, it is best to find the ruler of daimon at the lot of fortune or at its 10th place. If so, then the nativities are illustrious and distinguished. If it is in its proper place, meaning the 10th place from fortune, or at another angle relative to fortune, the nativities will be as distinguished and vigorous as they can be under the circumstances. So next slide. Okay, and then he gives a couple of examples here. You can see a lot of fortune is in Taurus. Counting 10 signs from Taurus lands us in Aquarius, where we find the ruler of fortune, Venus. So Venus is upon the 10th relative to fortune. And he says that this nativity went from humble and ordinary fortune to the fortune of a prefect and a wealthy man. Next slide. This is pretty much the same exact situation. A lot of fortune is in Pisces. 10th from Pisces is Sagittarius, where we find the ruler of fortune, Jupiter, in Sagittarius. And so Valens says of this nativity very similarly that he lived in his first years humbly and in poverty, but since stars of the same sect happened in operative places, he came into friendships and associations and received positions of royal trust. So when he's talking about, just as a quick aside, the stars of the same sect in operative places, he's referring to Venus on the ascendant and the moon in Cancer. Those are the moon is the ruling luminary of the chart, because this is a night chart, and her sekmate Venus, both of them in the strongest houses of the horoscope, the ascendant and the 10th house. So even with the fortune in Jupiter before in that example, being in weak places, it lends to a chart that is eminent and uh, um, distinguished. So next slide. Okay, so on the left, this is just an overview of perfecting from both of the places. On the left is perfecting from the ascendant. Again, years 1980 to 82 puts us in houses 6, 7, and 8. And then from Lot of Spirit puts us in houses 2, 3, and 4. And I'll go through each of these individually. Next slide. In 1980, from the ascendant, this puts us in house 6, which is Leo. The planetary ruler of Leo is the sun, which is in Leo here in its own domicile. And Venus, the greater benefic of the chart, is also with the sun in the 6th house. So in a 6th house perfected year, we would expect to maybe have some difficulties. The 6th house rules illness, accidents, injuries, but it also rules work. And the Venus significations are really prominent in this year for her. Venus rules women and beauty. And in her chart, Venus rules the 3rd house, which deals with communication, which includes tabloids and magazines. And it was this year that she actually worked. Her most prominent job was being a fashion model. We'll also note that the sun is 10th from the Lot of Spirit, and the Lot of Spirit again is the Lot of the sun. So the planet that this is its own lot is actually in the most powerful position at 10th place from the Lot of Spirit. So she has this natally. So when we get to this place and in her perfected year, natally that becomes activated, that prominence. So this is the very beginning of her rise. On the other side, in the Lot of Spirit, that puts us in house 2, where we see the moon conjoining with Jupiter, as has already been mentioned, 10th from fortune. So we have both of the lights that rule their own lots are 10th from their own place. So that's an extremely fortunate, rare instance for someone to have been born with. This is in her 2nd house of money, so this was literally how she was probably bringing in money for herself that year. I think that's all I wanted to say there. Yeah.
Wasn't she on the cover of 17 magazine?
That's actually this one.
Oh, that's
Spoiler,
here.
she's on the cover of 17 magazine. Yeah, that was this year. So this was 1981. She's 18 years old, and on the left side from the ascendant, this gives us the 7th house and her really kind of knockout condition, Mercury conjoining Pluto in the 7th. And so the 7th is relationships, but especially when there's a contract between two people, so contractual partnerships. And if you're reading Ptolemy, Mercury is in its exaltation in Virgo. So we're looking at a figure who is exalted, lifted up, esteemed within his own or her own domain. A month after her birthday, her cousin, a Mercury signification, had advised her, another Mercury signification, advising to sign a contract, Mercury 7th house, with a management company, Tower Productions, which she did. She then subsequently hired Gene Harvey as her manager, and that was again, a contractual collaborative relationship with an individual exalted in terms of wealth and power, influence, status, and favorability in his own field. And that contractual relationship actually allowed Whitney to navigate Mercury and steer through the music industry, which led to future opportunities. For example, in the following year, she would actually see exaltation herself when she would be a lead vocalist for a couple of artists, including Paul Jabara. So on the other side, and from the Lot of Spirit, this puts us in the 3rd house, sort of similar to the previous year when she started working as a model. We're now in the 3rd house from Spirit, and this is ruled by Venus, again in the 6th house of work, 10th from Spirit, conjoining the sun. And this is, as Ray mentioned, this is when she actually becomes, lands on the cover, one of the first Black models to land on the cover of a magazine. It was actually a women's fashion magazine. So we get the significations of the 3rd house of the magazine women with Venus and beauty. Okay, next slide. So this will be the last year that I'm looking at, the 1982. From the ascendant, this puts us in the 8th house. Actually, I'm going to start with from the Lot of Spirit. I'm going to hand this off to Kate, and I want to do the ascendant before I do that. So from the Lot of Spirit, this puts us in the 4th house. And the 4th house, naturally, classically, is home and family, the father. But if you think of the 4th house as containing the IC, which is the imum coeli, which is Latin, or Kylie, depending on what time period you're traveling to. Imum coeli in Latin means the bottommost part of the sky. It's the bottommost part of the chart, the 4th house. It's underneath the earth. And there is a vertical line that goes up to the MC and out into the atmosphere and touches a star at some point. And the other direction, the IC, going down through the 4th house, going down into the earth, eventually reaching the core of the earth. And that is and the 4th house is a symbolism of the humanity that we all share together on this earth. So the 4th house and the IC can have a symbolism of have a global or worldwide symbolism. And we actually also saw that with Julia Child's chart with her Mercury Venus situation in Virgo that Amy was talking about, that she had become a household name. So with this 4th house here, the ruler is Mercury. Mercury's in the 7th, exalted, conjoining Pluto. And it was at some point in the first quarter of 83, which is still this 4th house year, that she was discovered by Jerry Griffith, who was a representative for Arista Records, record company. And at this time, Whitney was performing with her mother at various like clubs in Manhattan. And so this representative, Jerry Griffith, then goes up to the top of the company, to an exalted person, to Clive Davis, who's the head of Arista Records, and he says, you have to come see her perform. So he gets her to come see her perform. And when Clive Davis does, he's so impressed that he, on the spot, offers her a worldwide record deal, which she would then sign later in April of that same year. And then just a couple months later in June was her first introduction to a global worldwide audience as she appeared on the Merv Griffith show performing the song Home, calling back to the 4th house from the Broadway musical The Wiz. And interestingly, from the lyrics of the song Home, it feels as this kind of spiritual significance of asking God, the Father, aka the 4th house, to bring her back home to herself. So from the ascendant, we're in the 8th house. This is also very significant. In the 8th house, we have the ruler of the lot of Spirit, Mars. And we also see that the ruler of the lot of Spirit, Mars, is angular to Cancer, the lot of Fortune, which is going back to the quote in Balance. That's where he says it's best to have the lot of Spirit is 10th or angular from Fortune. So we're activating this fortunate position of Mars, 8th house. And we also see that the solar return ascendant for that year is 16 degrees of Libra in this 8th house effective year. Also, the solar return ascendant right on the solar return Saturn right on the ascendant of the solar return chart, 17 Libra. And the ruler of the solar return ascendant Libra is Venus, who in that same solar return chart is in Cancer at 24 degrees in her 5th house, not far from the solar return midheaven at 19, which in turn is not far from the natal north node at 18 degrees of Cancer. All of these things activating her natal 5th house that contains, again, that powerful fortune and north node position that has its ruler, the moon, angular conjoined Jupiter, the ruler of the ascendant. Jupiter is literally Whitney herself, who's receiving the application from fortune from the moon. So we have, that's really the power of stacking these different timing techniques. So this is, you can use perfections in different ways like this, but you can also stack other timing techniques like transits and solar returns to produce more accurate predictions of the future, of what to expect in terms of more particular times of months or even days. So I think with that, I will pass it off back to Kate to bring it back to Antiscia. I think, did you want to talk about that, Kate, or no?
Yeah, thank you, Sam. I'm also want to say, as we move to the next slide, yeah, we're going to look at that solar return 82, such a critically important return chart. Yeah, you can see I have it set up here out of whole sign. This is Placidus, but I just really love to see those angles and look at the prominence, right, of Venus, as Sam mentioned. Super important because Venus is the ruler of the year, the Lord of year, ruling that 8th house profection from the ascendant. So I do want to welcome everyone else, Gray, Bear, Sam, to join in as we go through timing, and I share a little bit here, and we're going to hand it off and move around, weave around. There's many things we could say about this chart. We're not going to go into all the details, obviously, don't have time. I mean, look at that Mars, Jupiter. Wow. Okay. But Saturn on the ascendant, I mean, less than a degree, really impactful. Saturn is obviously a critically important planet in her chart. It's exalted here. Maybe on the next slide, you can see that 17-degree Libra is, the degree of her moon, 17 Aries. So you can see on the right chart, the right-hand chart, I've put the natal on the outside of the return. So you can always do this, flip back and forth between those, and you can see how prominent it brought the luminary of sect to other people. It's also really important when we are in a profected house, like in her case, the 8th house being Libra, when it happens to rise on a solar return as the ascendant. So note that. That's a big piece. So just really taking note of these pieces, and Saturn, prominent, Pluto, etc. So yeah, maybe next chart. As mentioned, this is the ruler of the year. And wouldn't you have it, the day that she performs on the Merv Griffin show and performs home is the exact transit of Venus to her sun. So you can see that here, the transits on the outside, and there's more we could say. The moon crossed the midheaven that day, and that would have been probably later in the evening, and maybe the show, I don't know when the show was recorded. I tried to look that up. But as we move to the next slide, you can see, and you remember, of course, that Venus is picking up the sun Neptune. So it's Venus Neptune really strongly on the cardinal axis. And yeah, I mean, I don't really need to say more, right? It describes itself, but just potent. So, noting a Lord of year, where its transits are going through the year becomes important. I don't know if people always like that language, but moving to the next slide. This we decided to throw in. I know secondary progressions are not exactly, I mean, they show up in a way. Someone else can speak to that, please, if you feel like it. But we couldn't help ourselves because Venus, Sun was conjunct. Now, of course, this is a long time period, but you can see how close it was, how deep in the underworld in a way. And in this kind of, when Venus is meeting the sun, like it is now, although that's a whole convoluted topic that we probably can't get into, that Venus is actually visible during this Kazemi, right, Gray? Right now, presently in 2025. So much to say, because that cycle is actually related to her cycle in Rise, but this secondary progression, this is another piece. This is confluence of timing techniques. So here is this time period in her life, this critically important conjunction showing kind of a death of an old life and the birth of a new life, the movement into a new world in a way, but just that potency. And it would be within a couple more years when the albums were really coming out that conjunction then hits the ascendant, her natal ascendant at 8, right? You can kind of count that 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees, 2.5 years to go. And let's see, next slide. Yeah. Nadia earlier walked us through some circumambulations, so walking through the bounds. And here we're directing from the ascendant. This is from AstroSeek. And you can look at many charts of people. You just type it in, do a little search, and click on traditional. And here we can see that she entered the all-important Venus bounds in 1980, which, if you remember, that ascensional time happened to overlay. And as Sam just showed through that timing of her career as a model starting. And then we see that trine to Venus. So you have Venus as one time lord for the time, and it switched from Mars at that opposition in 81. And I'm sure this could be unpacked in great detail, which we don't have time for, but to the trine, right, of Venus. So we have double time of Venus as a primary and participating ruler in 1983. And here is this broadcast national. Yeah. We move into the Mercury bound there in 1983 as well, right before her birthday. And that becomes extra important. In fact, I remember it was maybe a couple years ago, Larry had pointed this out with Whitney Houston, how, the moon is placed in the Mercury bounds, and you can see that the directions are about to get to the trine of the sun and the conjunction of the moon, bringing that light. Whoa. But the Mercury bounds, it's picking up that Antiscia, right? That Antiscia signature is being like broadcast when it enters Mercury. So next up, I think we move to you, Gray. Is that right?
Yeah, actually, while you're still here, though,
Yeah.
I think we forgot to mention, in addition to that Merv Griffin, broadcast being so huge, this is also the period where she signed the record contract
Massive.
with Clive Davis. And one thing that comes up, and we see this with other people that have similarly meteoric rises to fame and then tragic downfalls. Elvis Presley being a night chart, I see a similar thing with Saturn in a different weaving of timing techniques. But there's something really interesting about Saturn kind of looming in the background of being on the ascendant of that solar return. Where, she ultimately has some Saturn things showing up later on, like it can, and there's just a mysterious way with the timing. But yeah, you can keep going here to the next one.
Real quickly, even during this double Venus time, that natal opposition between Venus and Saturn, we can see kind of showing up with this very long recording process. And then a kind of slow reception to the album that then becomes the best-selling album. But if you had checked in the first few weeks after the release or first few months, you would not have gone, this is it. This is the big, big record. Is there something else you wanted to say about this part, Kate?
No, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, you get the feel of the pressure, pressure mounting, I think, with the Saturn on the...
Yeah, and so what Bear is just speaking to, you really see with the deck releasing. So this is from the lot of Spirit, the lot of Daimon, and so referencing back what Larry was talking about earlier. Remember, the lot of Daimon's the lot of the sun. It's this symbol of what is really arousing her to take action in the world. It has a lot to do with inner character, motivations, soul intentions. It does come in with vocation, and so we are animating, we're releasing that Scorpio lot of Daimon in the 9th, which also important. I forgot to mention earlier that she, not unlike Etta James, not unlike other singers like Nina Simone, these powerful Black women, comes up in the Black church, is noticed at a young age singing for choir, and her early, when she's leading into that record contract, it's actually gospel demos. And she does actually end up having the Preacher's Wife soundtrack was like the best-selling, I think, gospel album of all time, actually. So that definitely comes in with this ninth house of Scorpio. But so in the releasing leaves Scorpio not long before she turns 15 and comes to Sagittarius on level 1. And so we have this overall potential of this Sagittarius time period. Remember, whose Lord is that really important Jupiter in Aries. And again, remember, Sagittarius is her 10th natal chart. And so as we're moving through this time period, if you can see this period we're talking about where she signs this record contract and she has this breakthrough performance on Merv Griffin, that would actually be in Aquarius on level 2, governed by Saturn. There is an exact sextile between Saturn and Jupiter in her chart. Referencing Joey earlier, though, Saturn is overcoming Jupiter. And so in that same way, we're just seeing Saturn showing up in that solar return. There is sort of like a Saturn looming in the background when she signs a contract and all the consequences that will come out of this for her. And as Bear is mentioning, there is sort of a long process and leading to this album eventually coming out. And pretty amazingly, it comes out a month after the releasing on level 2 comes to Aries. So this is a really critical timing point because now we have the lord of this general period, Sagittarius, is Jupiter in Aries, and it's come to that place. You can flip it to the next slide. And remember, Aries is also the 10th sign from Fortune. And so this is an active angular sign of Fortune. It's also activating her sect light, but again, really importantly, it's activating Jupiter as being the lord of level 1. And we're also throwing in now, we're getting that tension of the 8th and the 2nd coming in with Mars being over there as her debut album comes out. And you can go to the next slide, I think. It doesn't become, as Bear is mentioning, though, even once this album comes out, it's doing pretty well. It does better on black charts at first. MTV's not really playing the first video, You Give Good Love. They think it's too R&B. And it's easy to forget now for the way some things have changed. She really did have to crash through barriers to get her music out. And that doesn't really happen until later in the year when Saving All My Love for You comes out. And this is such a smash hit that MTV basically does have to play it. And within this time period that she's in, so on the exact, now this is not releasing from the lot of Diamond, this is releasing from the lot of Fortune, which is very important to also release from. It does go with material prosperity and fortune. It does relate to health, but that's not the only, it's not just about health and accidents happening to you. And the actual day on level 2, we come to Pisces, where again, we're in a Cancer period ruled by that moon. Now we're having Pisces activated, her first house ruled by that Jupiter. So we're having that moon Jupiter come in here. The literal day this comes out is the day it comes to level 2. You could show the next slide to show that, just emphasizing how we're getting that moon Jupiter come together. And this was such a smash hit. It became her first actual number 1. And it leads into this record breaking streak of she keeps having then we get How Will I Know comes out. It goes to number 1. Then The Greatest Love of All comes out. It's number 1. And this is in this period. And within this period at the Grammys in February of 86, she not only wins the Grammy for Saving All My Love, her performance at the Grammys is so stunning that she ends up winning an Emmy Award for that. And I'd encourage you to actually watch her. And also just to speak to with transits, this whole album breaks and she comes out basically, and it's not when she has all these number 1 records, but it's coming out actually in the same Venus star point we have today. This album did come out with Venus retrograde in Aries, and there was actually a simultaneous Mercury retrograde in Aries and Venus retrograde in Aries, just like we have today, happening when this came out. So definitely honoring her with the Venus star point today. You can keep going. And Bear, do you want to go into this one more? This is just showing that in that same year, 85, it's an 11th house year, but this would be important because it's from fortune to be that Taurus. Yeah, Taurus perfection. I think you're muted if you want to.
Unmute didn't work for me. So that 11th house year from fortune, any 11th house year is going to activate this, but we're looking at fortune in particular. 11th from fortune is called the place of accomplishment, sometimes also translated as the place of acquisition, which is Taurus, the third place here. That's already going to be really significant when we have that year activation. And then when we look down to the level of the transit, this is just a couple days before, so we're really just looking at the solar return here. We've got an exalted moon, who's also the Lord of Fortune. Exalted moon, 11th from fortune. Well, that 11th place from fortune, the place of accomplishment, is activated. And if you follow the rest of this year, this is where we get to the Grammy performance. Happens February following this birthday. And that performance really does just catapult her into an entirely different league and sets off a streak, I think it is, of 7 consecutive number ones that are released. So we see this year having what we would kind of call a textbook setup, place of accomplishment, activated in the perfection. And then we've also got the exalted ruler of fortune in that place. I could say more, but for the sake of time, keep chugging along.
Mention of Venus exactly on the fortune. I forgot.
Right. Yes. No.
Yeah.
And Venus, who's the natural significator for this line of work, exactly on fortune, which happens to be in the bounds of Venus also. So Venus is in her own bounds. Quick note: if you take a look at the lots, the bound placements of the lots, you consistently find they really do point to a material manifestation. So here with fortune, fortune is going to manifest in this Venusian way. And when Venus comes to say, hey, I'm here for you, and we've got this perfect setup with the moon, that natal promise is really unlocked after this, after we've paved the way. And this is, of course, happening in a time period where we've got, and another timing technique in circumambulations, we've got Venus activated as well. So it's kind of Venus all the way down.
Notice the solar return fortune and spirit are both Venus ruled also. Seems to bring even more emphasis.
Yeah.
Lots going on.
Big time.
Yeah, so carrying on, and please chime in. Here we are continuing to circumambulate, and we're fast forwarding now, kind of far out. In fact, I guess at this point we didn't really note. I noted the Leo, Scorpio, Sun, Neptune, right, ripening at 38 in 2001. And if anyone wants to chime in about that, you can. But I did note that that was a time period where there was even a thought that she had died. There was some confusion. There are multiple things, Gray, that you've started to bring up around 2001 being.
Yeah, that was when she signed the record-breaking like $100 million contract. But then it's also like right when she performed that Michael Jackson concert, and people were really concerned about how she looked. And there had already been, her mom had already tried an intervention a couple years before that to get her into treatment. And when Bear alluded earlier to her bisexuality and queerness, Robin Crawford who had been her former romantic partner and then was a business associate, had also left working for her like a year before that. So she was already kind of spiraling there with the addictions while still signing these huge contracts. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's they were very good friends from childhood, right? I don't know. I think it's still a little unclear, the relationship. But so moving forward to the end of her life, which we have the return chart, I think, on the next slide for 2011, because she did die in February of 2012, was really just kind of noteworthy, shocking to see Saturn squarely on the ascendant of this chart again, and that would be a whole Saturn cycle during this time. And even noted at the time of her passing, Saturn had stationed retrograde at 29.5 degrees Libra. So really kind of just further emphasize, that was 1 week before she died. So backing up to that circumambulation slide, you can see, so walking through the chart, that in 2008, during a Jupiter period, you can see on the left-hand side, there's Jupiter bounds at age 40, entering that in 2004, but coming to the square of Saturn. And of course, it was noted Saturn's overcoming placement, the opposite, just so much intense Saturn signature. And I guess it's also in curtailed passage, a lot of emphasis, lots of things that you will unpack. And like today was meant to be kind of a taste of what these Time Lord and other timing techniques really deliver. But here in 2010, she entered the Saturn bounds. So you have this participating Saturn with then the Time Lord bound Lord Saturn, double Saturn time come 2011, 12.
And as Gray mentioned earlier, Saturn is 8th from fortune. And that's something that Valens points out, that planets in the 8th place, also called death, or planets that are 8th from fortune, are going to be significators of death. And we see, if we look at these circumambulations, she had encountered Saturn with the superior sextile of Saturn earlier in life. And that's actually during a time period where the bodyguard is released. So we can see Saturn showing up in that instance as, the reluctance of Warner Brothers to have a film with an interracial relationship. Kevin Costner talked about how much pressure there was for them to talk about that, and that he felt really proud of the movie, that wasn't even a facet of the movie. They just incidentally were an interracial couple. But that wasn't a focus of the storyline in any way. But the second encounter with Saturn is this time the superior square, much more malefic, and Saturn's already showed up once kindly, and so this time it's going to show up in a more fatal way, or a crisis-producing way.
And the Mars is in the solar return chart is also very close to her natal fortune of applying, I guess.
Yeah. And that's the peril. I think we have already gone over a little bit of time. We could talk forever, and we did leading up to this, but we want to return you all to your day. Oh yeah, we've got more, but we won't show it all. Thank you everyone for your time, and thank you for letting this Venus Cazimi be a day of celebrating incredible women.
Awesome, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Bear, Gray, Kate, and Sam. A fascinating set of presentations, and for all of the presenters today, thank you so much on behalf of Kepler College. I actually want to echo a statement and a comment made in the chat before by Amber Ford, saying this is my dream team. And certainly at Kepler College, we are fortunate to have such a great group of teachers for this new Hellenistic certificate, both the natal and the timing technique. So thank you all so much for wonderful presentations. Let me ask everybody here, has anyone been here for the full day? Let us know in the comments.
Bear has. Good for you, Bear.
Yeah.